Uh, Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for our audience in Latin America as well. My name is Yeghia Tashjian, and I'm the Regional and International Affairs Cluster Coordinator at the ISAM-FAIS Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Peru. IFI is a university-based policy think tank. We seek to identify policy options and future scenarios by fostering dialogue and debate on topics addressing local, regional, and international developments. Today, we're pleased to host a joint webinar with our university's Political Science and Public Administration Department and the Pontificia Catholic University of Peru. This is our first joint webinar titled Beyond Great Power Rivalry, China-U.S. Competition in the Middle East and Latin America, a Global South Perspective. We chose the following topic because it is highly relevant as we aim to move the discussion beyond the traditional binary narrative of a new Cold War and instead examine how states and local actors in the Global South actively reshape, negotiate, and respond to competition between China and the United States. For audiences in the Middle East and Latin America, this topic is important because both regions have become central arenas of economic, technological, political, and strategic competition. China's growing role through infrastructural investments, namely the Belt and Road Initiative, trade partnerships, energy cooperation, digital technologies, and financial engagement, increasingly intersects with long-standing U.S. political, military, and economic influence in those regions. Yet, regional actors are not simply passive recipients of outside pressure. Countries across these regions are pursuing pragmatic and diversified foreign policies aimed at maximizing economic opportunities, preserving sovereignty, and avoiding overdependence on a single power. A Global South perspective is necessary because both analyses of China-USA competition are framed through Western strategic lenses that prioritize superpower rivalry itself rather than the priorities of regional societies. Such approaches often overlook local concerns. Hence, by using the perspective of the Global South, the key question here is not simply who will dominate, but rather, how do Middle Eastern and Latin American states navigate competition to advance their own national and regional interests? We are pleased to host two distinguished speakers, Dr. Hilal Khachan, Professor for Political Science at the American University of Beirut, and Dr. Nifta, a Professor in the Department of Social Sciences at the Pontificia Catholic University of Peru. Thank you for joining us. I want to start with U.S. President Donald Trump's recent visit to China. During his visit, Trump held extensive talks, actually, with Chinese President Xi Jinping, focused on trade, technology, Taiwan, artificial intelligence, and of course, the wars in Iran and Ukraine. Economically, both sides discussed expanding trade ties, while Beijing pushed for eased U.S. restrictions on advanced technological exports. The two countries also explored creating a new bilateral Board of Trade and Board of Investment mechanisms to manage economic relations and investment flows. On geopolitical issues, Trump sought Chinese cooperation regarding Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, while China warned that mishandling Taiwan could trigger a serious confrontation. Although no strategic breakthrough or a formal treaty emerged, the visit produced several preliminary economic understandings and a broader agreement to stabilize relations and continue high-level dialogue amid growing global tensions. So I want to ask the first questions, and each of you, of course, can reflect or provide the perspective of his or her region. How was the visit, first of all, perceived by local actors and the media in the Middle East and Latin America, and what's the significance actually of this visit in the international order? Maybe Dr. Khachan, you can answer first.
Yeah, thank you, Yeghia. Well, it depends on the recipients of the outcome of President Trump's visit to China. The Iranians were quick to declare that Trump's attempts to draw a wedge between China and Iran did not succeed, and that Iran and China will maintain their strategic relations for a very long time to come. However, on the other hand, the Gulf states were apprehensive about the meeting. Gulf states do not trust Trump's transactional politics, and they fear that any rapprochement between China and the U.S. on Iran may eventually lead to empowering Iran in the region. And this is dreaded by the Gulf countries. So the outcome of this visit, will remain to be seen depending on future possible engagements by the two countries. However, despite the sense of euphoria by the Iranians, Chinese committed themselves to the U.S. not to provide military hardware to Iran during this conflict, and the Chinese policy remains of non-military commitment to Middle Eastern issues, and it prefers to deal with the crises as an arbitrator and as a peace negotiator.
Dr. Lu, maybe your perspective, how the local media in Latin America perceive this development.
Okay, sure. First of all, good morning, everyone, and thank you again for the invitation. I would say that in Latin America, Trump's visit to China was perceived less as a purely bilateral diplomatic event and more as a symbolic episode of the reconfiguration of international order. For instance, several media outlets interpreted the meeting not as the end of U.S. and China confrontation, but as an attempt to stabilize it. For example, in Peru, where I'm based, Diario El Comercio framed the summit as the evidence that confrontation and cooperation is not contradictory, but rather two sides of administrated rivalry. In El Comercio, the same outlet emphasized that behind all this ceremony, behind the diplomatic smiles, issues such as, like you said, such as trade, Iran, and the Taiwan issue remained integral points of the negotiation. And I think this was also a consistent reading with the international coverage, because the visit was described as rich in ceremony, but limited in the concrete outcomes, especially on these issues, Iran, Taiwan, and trade. And in some Latin American countries, I read also in Argentina, for instance, La Nación, it emphasized that Trump returned without major concrete concessions or a concrete win. So the meeting in Argentina, in La Nación, was read as a projected image to stabilize for international stability. And also another image was of President Xi Jinping as a full peer competitor of with China, of the United States. And in terms of its significance for international system, I think I would like to highlight 2 points. The first is that this visit and how it was framed confirms that we are not in a unipolar moment anymore. The fact that the U.S. president traveled to Beijing and tried to reach some agreement shows that Beijing is a central player and that the U.S. is recognizing that. But on the other hand, like you mentioned, the question that I think comes to the picture is that what's going to happen, at least with Latin America, because if U.S. and China relations stabilize, then if the optimistic picture, I think, it's that Latin American countries will gain room to maneuver and to diversify their partnerships without being forced to choose. But the question is that if this is going to be the most likely scenario.
You mentioned the optimistic scenario. What about the pessimistic scenario? Opinion.
The pessimistic scenario, I think, it would be a polarization in a sense that each country forces the Latin American country to choose one side or the other, and where policy options become loyalty tests. So yeah, that would be the least convenient outcome for Latin American countries.
Thank you. Now I want to talk a bit about the soft power and the hard power tools that both countries are employing, actually both in Latin America and the Middle East, because I want to later to analyze like how these instruments also differ in terms of scope, intensity, and intent between two regions. Maybe Dr. Hilal, you can comment first.
Sure. I mean, the U.S. Foreign policy in the Middle East is based on hard power. As we know, there are many U.S. military bases throughout the Gulf. And the U.S. is mainly interested in counterinsurgency, keeping Iran at bay, preventing it, as we all know, from acquiring nuclear weapons. And also one of the main issues behind American hard power is to provide military hardware to the Gulf countries. Now, as far as soft power, yes, the US also exercises soft power. And actually, it has been very easy for the US to play the role of a soft power provider. US universities, Middle Easterners like to study in the US. There is also fascination in the Middle East by American folk culture. So, and of course, the US at least used in the past to provide aid to Gulf countries, but not anymore. However, on the other hand, China's main role is to use soft power. China exercises or plays the role of a negotiator. In 2023, they successfully reached an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia to restore their diplomatic relations. China is very much interested in the acquisition of the region's oil resources. And this has played an important role in shaping Chinese policy in the region, especially in the Gulf countries. Now, however, in recent years, and in order to diversify the sources of military procurement, the Gulf countries have become engaged with China in transacting arms deal. That's an example of the changing role of China as a hard power player. There is an increasing need in the Middle East for drones and drone technology. China also signed deals with Saudi Arabia on the provision of missile technology, especially ballistic missiles. And so China has been playing a role in helping the Gulf countries, namely Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in diversifying the sources of their military procurement. The Gulf countries are very much interested in this approach because they don't want to continue to rely on Western technology in providing military hardware. Because when it comes to China, China provides military hardware with no strings attached, as the case is with Western powers who make demands about the use of military hardware provided to them. So the two countries use hard power and soft power, even though the Chinese are more inclined to use soft power, and the use of their hard power is incipient. It is beginning to unfold, and we don't know how it will evolve in the future. However, in your other questions, I may be able to shed more light on this matter.
Thank you, Dr. Khachan. And even it's worth mentioning that the first universities and education centers, both American and Chinese, were established in Lebanon. Even the Confucius Center, for example, in the Middle East, the first host was Lebanon. Dr. Nifta, maybe you can provide Latin American perspective when it comes to how these actors are exercising their soft and hard power tools.
Yeah, I would say that the picture is sort of similar because in Latin America, China and the US deploy different combinations of hard and soft power. But I would say that in recent years, especially recent years, the difference between the two is not quite clear. Because in practice, economic instruments may become a source of political leverage and also can produce soft power effects. At the same time, cultural and public diplomacy can also support very strategic and concrete objectives. So, in a sense, China's hard power presence in Latin America is completely limited compared to with other regions, and it doesn't have the same level of military projection, bases, or formal security agreements or alliances that the U.S. has historically maintained with the region. So like Dr. Khachan said, that China's strongest tools in Latin America are economic and infrastructural, trade, investment, development finance, and recently green technologies. But also China's engagement, especially in the later years, should not be reduced to economics. Because I would like to emphasize, based on my own research, is that China is increasingly connecting this, I would call it material engagement or material delivery with soft power practices. So that means that around infrastructure, trade, and investment, China is being increasingly deploying narratives of development, modernization, win-win, mutual benefit, and South-South cooperation. And also in recent years, what has been expanding is this range of cultural and public diplomacy instruments, because now we have more educational exchanges, media engagement, cultural events, and even subnational relations. And I would draw Peru's example. I think that it's pretty clear because we have here Chancay Megaport, and it's not only a logistics project. So it is a symbolic project, and especially how it was framed during the APEC meeting and when the port was formally inaugurated. Because it was framed on the media, and it tells among public audiences, tells this story about how Peru has a future, is going to become a hub between Asia and South America on the one hand. And on the other hand, it also presents China as a partner that it's capable of delivering large-scale infrastructure such as the port. So in this sense, what it's really interesting is that the port is both material and narratives. Of course, it moves goods, but it also produces, especially among local audiences, this image and hope for connectivity, modernization, and also shared development. But on the other hand, and maybe you have read on the news, Chancay also shows the limits, I would say, and tensions of Chinese soft power, because the project itself has generated, although it's private, it has generated questions of sovereignty, regulation, environmental impacts, local benefits, and even this potential strategic use. So, I mean, this means that China does not only need to build infrastructure, but also has to find a way to make infrastructure appeal and appear socially and politically acceptable for the local population. And the U.S., on its part, it retains an enormous soft power in assets in Latin America, historically and institutionally. And also it has a long-standing security cooperation with many countries. But I would say that in the U.S. case, its recent challenge is that its engagement appears defensive or reactive, warning countries about China, emphasizing risks, such as in the case of the Chancay Megaport, or seeking to secure supply chains, such as it's moving Argentina with lithium. And I have a colleague also here in Peru. His name is Antonio Pagan. He's also studies this topic about the U.S. And China in terms of security alliances in Latin America. And what he told me is that the U.S. alliance and partnership system remains as the strongest dimension of American power in the region. But again, it depends on whether the U.S. acts proactively or merely reacts to these Chinese initiatives. Because when the U.S. only warns countries about China, the message can be read as defensive. But on the brighter side, if the U.S. offers concrete alternatives, again, it's what would be a really good option when it offers concrete alternatives in investment. I mean, another port, it becomes more persuasive and it would be well received in Latin America. So I would say that's the key difference between hard and soft power between two countries in Latin America.
Thank you so much. And also, like, I want to ask both of you, how do the states and the regional actors are navigating or resisting or leveraging great power competition at the same time in order to advance their own strategic autonomy? Maybe Dr. Khachan, you can comment?
Yeah, thank you, Yeghia. The approach of the Gulf countries in dealing with the U.S. and the Chinese rivalry is through hedging and multi-alignment strategies. Hedging, the Gulf countries rely heavily on the U.S. for military procurement. Of course, China is providing military hardware, but the bulk of military supplies come from the West, specifically the United States. So here, the Gulf countries are involved in what one may call realignment and using diverging strategies, because they know the US and China have different objectives in the region. The Gulf countries heavily invest in military hardware from the US, but on the other hand, they also invest in China's Belt and Road Initiative, and China remains the dominant economic partner with most Gulf countries. So here, this is the deal. Economic interaction with China that outweighs similar interaction with the US, and military dependence on the West, specifically the United States. Now, the Gulf countries see this rivalry between the US and China not as a challenge, but rather as an opportunity, because it allows them to maximize their gains in interacting with the two superpowers. We live in a changing world, and the Gulf countries have reached the conclusion that they may not be completely reliant on American military support in times of crisis. As we know, in 2019, the Houthis in Yemen attacked several oil installations in the kingdom, and the US did nothing to counter the Houthi attack. So the Gulf countries are interested in broadening the scope of their alliances to make sure that should one country or should the US fail in supporting them in time of need, they can turn to China, even though at this juncture in history, the Chinese are not interested in escalation with the US. Their main concern is trade, and they want to promote international peace so that Chinese exports could further flourish.
Thank you, Dr. Nifta. Maybe Latin American perspective.
I think echoing what you said, Latin American countries are not just passive recipients of Chinese or US influence or deals. I think that in this case, strategic autonomy doesn't mean neutrality. So it means expanding the country's menu of options. I can take Brazil as an example here, because Brazil has the diplomatic tradition, market size, and regional way to avoid a binary choice between the US and China. Brazil cooperates with China in trade, agriculture, infrastructure, energy, and BRICS, and while also maintaining channels of cooperation with the US in finance, security, institutional cooperation, and as well investment. And in this case, I mean, for Brazil, it's not a contradiction, it's diversification, because Brazil's decision to not formally join the Belt and Road Initiative while still deepening cooperation with China, I think it's especially revealing. It shows that Brazil is willing to work with China, but on its own terms and preserving its diplomatic agency. Peru, on the contrary, is quite different, because Peru's autonomy is constrained by domestic political instability and regulatory weakness. So, on the one hand, China is Peru's major economic partner in terms of mining, infrastructure, while the US still remains an important partner for Peru on the trade agreement, investment, education, and security. In the case of Argentina, for instance, it's another useful case because competition is sharper in terms of finance and strategic resources, such as lithium. In Argentina, even when Milei is ideologically closer to the US, China remains a difficult player to ignore, because it's the major buyer of soy, lithium, and beef to Argentina, and because of the currency swap. And so, in another point in case, like I mentioned, this US-Argentina critical minerals agreement that was signed a couple of months ago is an example again that Washington has this attempt to reinsert or reposition itself in lithium and supply chains. But Argentina's own foreign minister has clarified that this doesn't mean that Chinese investment will be excluded from the lithium sector. So I would say that Latin American autonomy is not uniform. It depends on the country. But in all three cases, it can be seen as these countries are not simply choosing between one side or the other. They are trying to manage and to do the best to extract benefits from both. Yeah.
Thank you. And here I want also to make a small comment that an invitation was sent to Argentina to join the BRICS, and Argentina declined. Do you think this was a reflection of the strategic autonomy of Argentina, or there was also pressure maybe by the US, or maybe the administration in Argentina refused to join the BRICS?
I would say it depends on when we're talking about. We know that Milei is ideologically and politically closer to the US. So in that sense, it is ideological proximity, but as well in terms of economic effects, they are difficult to ignore. So I think that there are sectors, maybe political leaders, that they are pushing to continue with engagement with China. But politically, Argentina is more aligned with the US.
Thank you. Here there is this argument actually always being discussed that is it true that Latin America remains more economically oriented in its engagement with China, while the Middle East reflects a more maybe geopolitical and the security dimension? Maybe Dr. Hilal, you can comment on this.
Yeah, well, the Gulf countries are interested in furthering the geopolitical importance of the region. For example, the control of choke points such as the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb. As you know, for years, the UAE tried hard to gain access to the port of Aden and to control the Bab el-Mandeb, and that caused a fury between the UAE, between specifically Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia. But it is safe to say that by playing a role in controlling, of course, we cannot ignore the Iranian influence here in closing the Strait of Hormuz. So the Gulf countries, including Iran, can use their control of the choke points to their advantage. As you know, the international community is outraged by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and as we know, it impacted all aspects of life worldwide. And the European countries are trying to find a way out of this situation. So there is something else that the Gulf countries can do. I think they are beginning to engage in what we may call strategic rebalancing. That is, try to get the most of what they could from the US and China. They understand that there is a keen competition between the two superpowers, that this competition will not reach the point of a direct confrontation. So here the argument is that they can make the most in dealing with these two countries. And this reminds me of the situation of the non-aligned countries in the 1950s, when they took a middle-of-the-road stand between the Soviet bloc and the US-led Western bloc. And whenever they would feel that the West would not give them what they wanted, they would lean to the Soviet bloc. And here, these countries think that they can do the same thing and take advantage of the keen competition between them in order to achieve greater interests. Therefore, they see the rivalry between the US and China as a true opportunity. They don't really see it as a liability or as a problem, and they think they can navigate it. Now, one of the things that the Gulf countries are doing is to invest in multi-alignment roles. They know that the US and Chinese roles in the region, and actually worldwide, are diverging. And these countries in the Gulf they really believe that they stand a great opportunity in dealing with them, because the two countries are interested in gaining the Gulf countries to their side.
Thank you, Dr. Nifta, maybe your perspective.
On whether Latin America is more economically oriented in its engagement with China. I would say yes, but only partially. It is true that China's engagement with Latin America has been primarily economic in its point of entry, especially if we're talking about the 2000s up until the 2015. The relationship, of course, expanded after China's accession into the WTO through trade, commodity demand. Back then, the pattern was quite simpler, I would say. Export commodities to China and import manufacture or higher value-added goods from China. But now it has been expanding trade as well, and cooperation through telecommunications and green technologies. So in Latin America, I would say that this economical dimension has also become geopolitical, because when we're discussing, I would say, elements such as ports, lithium, copper, energy, and logistics corridors, these are not neutral sectors. These can become strategic, because they can shape future dependencies, regulatory standards as well, locally and internationally. They have also the possibility of shaping supply chains and especially, and what matters here as well, long-term political leverage. So although China doesn't project military power in Latin America the way that the U.S. Does globally, I would call it its economic footprint. Footprint has also strategic consequences. Again, with the case of Peru, Shanghai is economically framed as a logistics and trade project, and it's private. But it also has geopolitical meaning because it has the potential, or it may reorganize South American trade routes towards the Pacific and Asia. And again, it also raises questions about who controls strategic infrastructure, how the Peruvian state regulates the port, and especially how the U.S. interprets Chinese presence in Western Hemisphere. So this becomes geopolitical. And Argentina is another case with lithium, because lithium is an economic sector, but it's also strategic because it is central to energy transition, which is a highly debated topic now, and which is, I would say, calling efforts from academic centers, governments to engage in research in energy transition. And lithium also matters for supply chain security. This is why, like I mentioned, both China and the U.S. are interested in Argentina's lithium, and they are kind of managing to maintain their presence, although the U.S. has signed this agreement with Argentina. So, and even this attempt from the U.S. reflects a strategy of the U.S. to secure supply chains, and while Chinese firms remain active in the sector. So, yeah, I would say that maybe in the 2000s up until 2010s, the pattern was quite simpler, and China's economic engagement with Latin America was economically oriented. But now it's not merely economic, because these economic instruments, when we are talking about green technologies, when we're talking about logistics corridor or in certain infrastructure, these are becoming strategic instruments as well.
Thank you so much. Want to move maybe further to geopolitics. So in what also ways does this rivalry or competition between China and the US in these regions contribute to, or to some extent constrain, the emergence of the multipolar, or let's say the multiplex international system? Dr. Khachan, maybe you can comment first.
Yeah, the Gulf countries are not really very much interested in a multipolar system, but they have to negotiate it and deal with it. The Gulf countries prefer the traditional alliance system, which meant, as you know, in 1945, a strategic deal was struck between bin Saud and President Roosevelt, whereby the U.S. became the protector of Saudi sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, the problem with a multipolar system is that it is transactional and it keeps shifting and is based on ad hoc alliances, something that the Gulf countries do not like to become acquainted with. Therefore, in dealing with the likelihood of a changing world order, no matter how things unfold, the region will continue to become heavily dependent on the US, even if the behavior of President Trump seems to be transactional and the Gulf countries do not really trust American commitments to the Gulf security. And this goes back actually to the 1950s. I mean, there is nothing new about it. In the mid-1950s, there was a conflict between Oman and Saudi Arabia over Al-Buraimi oasis. The Omanis took it over, and the Saudi Arabians wanted the US to invoke the treaty and the deal that they reached in 1955. But the US did not respond. They said, no, this matter is not significant and you have to deal with the British. And again, in 1962, after the Republican coup in Yemen, Egyptian planes, bombarded Saudi positions on the other side of the border, and the Saudis appealed to President Kennedy to send troops, but the US was not really interested. Actually, they felt that the coup in Yemen was a good thing for Yemen because it took them out of the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. Having said that, the US sent 5 starfighter jets to Jeddah just to make token flights of support to the Saudis. So here, the situation is that the Gulf countries, namely the Saudis, do not have full faith in US commitment to defend them. So they prefer to become involved in multi-alignment. They use the multi-alignment strategy just in case the US lets them down. They want to have good relations with the China as a form of strategic rebalancing. That is, should the US let us down, we may count on the good offices or even the direct support of China. But as far as a changing world system, the Gulf countries are do not feel comfortable dealing with an unexpected geopolitical environment. They don't like to deal with an unpredictable situation.
Mhm. And what about Turkey and Iran? Do you think that this emerging world order also serves their strategic interests?
Could you repeat, please? I didn't get it.
What about Iran and Turkey? Do you think that this emerging global order serves their interests?
No, not really. Actually, there is a talk right now about a new order that would include Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Pakistan, and Turkey. But let's keep in mind that the UAE will never be part of this alliance. The UAE has opted for affiliation with Israel. So should this happen, the UAE would become a spoiler. Despite the improvement of relations between Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Turkey, yet there is aversion and there's a deep-seated aversion to interaction with them because history stands in the way. Relations between Turkey and Egypt are not good, and they began to improve shyly last week, and the two countries became involved in joint military exercises. And again, the same thing goes for Saudi and Turkish relations. The first and second Saudi states were destroyed by the Ottomans. The first one in 1818 by Ibrahim Pasha, who acted upon the instructions from Istanbul to put an end to the first Saudi state, and they did it. And the main adversaries of the Saudi royal family of Ibn Saud in the 19th century and even in the beginning of the 20th century were pro-Ottoman tribes. And when Ibn Saud decided finally to attack Al-Ahsa in the eastern province, his argument was that he wanted to get rid of Ottoman presence or Turkish presence in the region. So I don't know to what extent this alliance could work because, again, the US, the Gulf countries will not be interested in antagonizing the US. The US and Israel will definitely try to blockade such an alliance.
Thank you. Dr. Nifta, what about your perspective, maybe?
Yeah, on whether the US-China rivalry's effect on the emergence of a multipolar international order. I think the US-China rivalry contributes to multipolarity when it expands the options for Latin American countries. Because for much of the 20th century, Latin America was often treated as part of the US sphere of influence. But China's rise in the beginning of the 21st century has changed that. Now, Latin American countries can negotiate with Washington, China, Brussels, regional development banks, multilateral institutions, private investors, And this diversification can increase bargaining power for Latin American countries. Because if a country needs infrastructure, then it can compare different sources of financing and technology. If a country needs investment in energy or minerals, it can negotiate with Chinese or American or European banks or regional actors. In that sense, multipolarity becomes practical through this expansion of policy options. But this rivalry can also constrain multipolarity if it becomes a zero-sum game, because when the United States frames Chinese engagement or Chinese projects as primarily security threats, or when China frames criticism as containment, then Latin American countries' options or menu of options becomes narrower because countries are then pressured to choose between sides instead of according to their own development strategies. And Peru illustrates this tension very clearly because Chancai's port should be discussed or could be discussed as a development issue, logistics, environmental, or a regulatory issue. That should be the narrative of or discussion around Chancai. But once it is interpreted through this lens of U.S. and China rivalry, the conversation then becomes securitized. What this means is that other questions surrounding the project that may be more relevant, especially for the local communities, are obscured or are put to the sidelines. Because then, if we frame the project on U.S.-China rivalry, these other questions such as what kind of employment is generated through Chancai Port, or who regulates the port, or what do local communities gain? And especially, I would say, for Peru, it should be important. How can Peru capture value beyond a port that it's basically transit infrastructure? So these are other questions that are often put to the sidelines. And in the ideal case, then multipolarity should and could expand the options for Latin American countries. But when it constrains multipolarity, when it becomes a matter of choosing silence, of choosing sides, and then it becomes a matter of loyalty tests.
Thank you so much. Before maybe moving to the possible scenarios, there are some questions coming from the audience. So I want to sum up one of the key questions were like, are regional organizations and South-South cooperation mechanisms becoming more effective in mediating great power competition? Maybe Dr. Hilal, you can comment on this.
Well, there is no question that the emergence of China as a superpower, I mean, an economic superpower. China has not yet become a military superpower or now middle-sized countries are emerging as regional competitors. For example, you mentioned a minute ago about the likelihood of an alliance between Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan. Yes, again, even though in a transforming international order, middle-sized countries stand a good chance of becoming significant players, yet they cannot operate outside the international umbrella. They cannot operate independently of U.S. and Chinese, I would say, hegemony over international relations. I don't see the rise of mid-sized countries as a challenge to the greater powers, but I would see the role as complementary to their power. You know, we know that the U.S. for the past 2 years, the U.S. policy in the Middle East has been one of retrenchment. That is, avoid the region, allow local actors to manage the affairs of the Middle East. Of course, the recent U.S. military campaign against Iran was orchestrated by the U.S. I mean, President Trump is doing what previous presidents refused to do. And again, it is evident that no matter how much destruction is done in Iran, the U.S. seems to have been quagmired in Iran. So I would say that the role of the newly emerging mid-sized states will actually come to the relief of the greater powers because they don't want to meddle in minute regional details. The U.S. A few years ago, as you know, was in a mood to abandon the Middle East, not to abandon its strategic interest in the Middle East, but to abandon minute issues. They pulled out of Iraq, and they wanted to commission the local countries in the region to manage their affairs, whereby the U.S. could focus on the Pacific. The Gulf region, the Middle East, has lost to a large degree its strategic importance for the U.S. Since the years of Obama's presidency, the U.S. decided to make a shift from the shores of the Atlantic Ocean to the shores of the Pacific. So again, let me reiterate, the rise of mid-sized countries is welcome because it eases the pressure on major powers.
Thank you, Dr. Nifta. Any additional maybe comments on this?
I would say that regional mechanisms have become more relevant, especially now than ever, because locality has become central to international politics. The value of locality, of learning about countries, and I can say maybe 10 years ago, when discussing this range of cultural or public diplomacy instruments that China has been deploying and developing, for instance, Confucius Institutes, cultural exchanges. I was doing research in Mexico. I could notice that the focus of this was to increase, of course, mutual understanding, but the focus was to increase in Mexico, or especially among firms, among academics and students, the understanding about China. I could see that more clearly. But now the interest that China has is also going abroad to engage with local academics, local leaders, especially local community leaders, local politicians, and also learn about the country and their communities. Go back and adapt their strategies. So that's why, and I can find this kind of parallelism between why regional mechanisms matter, because again, locality is becoming central, especially if we're talking about finding or promoting development opportunities for countries. You have to adapt locally and have to get to know the community, what are their risks, their regulatory frameworks. So I would say I would also agree on that.
Thank you so much. Now I want to maybe reflect on the possible or plausible scenarios. I know that in political science this can be challenging sometimes to discuss scenarios, but what are the scenarios for U.S.-China relations in these regions over the next decade? Maybe Dr. Hilal, Khachan, you can start with the Middle East. I know this is the $1 billion word question, where we are heading within the context of this competition.
Contrary to what many people think, relations between the U.S. and China are not dichotomous. The Chinese and the U.S. economies are intertwined, and they operate on the basis of interdependence, and the same logic applies to the countries of the Middle East. Now, China is interested in trade and free trade, and it is aware of the limitations imposed by the U.S. That's why the Chinese came up with the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative, because Chinese trade has to go through choke points controlled by the U.S. Therefore, it is China's vested interest to maintain good relations with the U.S. And I think, I mean, I know that the Chinese foreign policy is mature, and Chinese leaders make reasonable and rational decisions. So I don't think that the rivalry between the US and China would ever lead to an armed conflict. And Chinese policy on Taiwan is an example of that. The Chinese will never use force in order to retake Taiwan. They know that trying to take it over by force will have a negative impact on their stature as a super economic power. So I don't see the threat of escalation between the US. Through the US, China is the largest world exporter. However, but the advantage is that China, thanks to its exporting policy, is able to infuse funds into the international system. That also leads to economic recovery and also stimulates the international economy. And by the same token, the Gulf countries are interested in interdependence. They understand that the world economy and international relations are based on interdependence, which is a good mechanism to avoid conflicts. Of course, there are divisions, there are rivalries, but they will never reach the point of open conflict. So when it comes to that, the Gulf countries are aware of the importance of interdependence. However, the problem with the Gulf countries is that they are inherently insecure. They are insecure about their well-being, their survivability, and they have difficulty ensuring reliance on the US, even though I need to reiterate, the US will remain the most important provider of security to Gulf countries, yet the Gulf countries do not fully trust US commitment to them. And this explains why the Gulf countries, especially the UAE, Qatar, and the UAE, Qatar, have a large number of foreign bases. The French, the Italians, the Turks in Qatar. Qatar hosts the largest American air base in the region. So these countries are interested in diversifying the sources of their security. And that's why they invested in strategic rebalancing, that is dealing with as many countries as possible, of course, especially the US and China, to ensure their security, because they came to the conclusion that they cannot depend on one actor. And here comes the role of China as a diplomatic powerhouse.
Thank you, Dr. Nifta. What about the possible scenarios in Latin America?
I agree with Dr. Khachan. US and China's economies are deeply intertwined, but if we want to simplify scenarios to the extreme, I would set three possible scenarios, especially in terms of economic engagement. First would be sort of managed competition, where the US and China continue competing in trade, infrastructure, technology, but Latin American countries maintain relations with both. This would be the best scenario for the region because it would allow countries to diversify partners and also negotiate on better terms. The second scenario, which I think is the most likely and that has been developing in the latest years, is this sort of fragmented or sectorial competition, where competition increases in certain sectors, such as ports, lithium, energy grids, digital telecommunications, supply chains. But pragmatic cooperation, more traditional cooperation, will continue in other areas such as agriculture, education, finance, commodities, and trade. In this scenario, countries will not have to choose to align with one or another power across all issues. They will cooperate with China in some sectors and will cooperate with the U.S. in other sectors, and with both when possible. The case again of Argentina's lithium sector, Peru's port infrastructure, or Brazil's clean energy illustrates this. These are examples of this fragmented competition where it is likely to increase between both countries. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the third scenario would be polarization. This would occur if the U.S. pressures Latin American governments to exclude China and to exclude Chinese firms from strategic sectors. Or it would also occur if Beijing increases or manages to increase financial dependence of the Latin American countries. This would be the most costly scenario for Latin America, because it will reduce, of course, the strategic options for the countries. And like I mentioned, it would turn a policy decision that it should be essentially a policy decision into loyalty tests. And as implications would vary by country. It would depend on their level of autonomy, institutional capacity. So I would say that Latin America is far or will not simply become a Chinese sphere of influence, but it would also not go back to an uncontested U.S. sphere. So the most likely scenario is this issue-based or sector competition where countries cooperate with China in some issues and with the U.S. in other issues. Like I mentioned, again, what's going to give these countries the freedom to choose and actually the leverage to transform a policy decision into development, it's going to be if these countries can build enough institutional capacity to convert competition into their own benefit or into development.
Thank you so much. I believe that we have covered the topic and addressed key questions. So the relevance of this topic lies in recognizing that the future of the international order will not be determined solely by the great powers themselves, but also by how countries of the global south respond to, resist, reshape, or benefit from the evolving competition. So I want to thank the panelists again, Dr. Khachan and Dr. Lu, so much for joining us, to the organizers, our colleagues from the Pontificia Catholic University of Peru, AUB's PSPA department, and the chairperson and IFI's communication team for helping us to organize this timely webinar. And we hope to see you next time. And please join our mailing list for future events. Thank you so much.